I still remember the sound the hospital made when it died. Not an explosion, nothing so dramatic. It was a groan, deep and structural, like a building exhaling its last breath through fractured steel and crumbling concrete. 14 of us watched from the rooftop of a parking structure 2 blocks east as St. Michael's Medical Center, our home for the previous 41 days, buckled inward at the 3rd floor and folded into itself like a body collapsing to its knees. Marcus grabbed my arm so hard his fingernails drew blood through my jacket sleeve. "That's everything," he whispered. "That's all of it." He meant the medicine, the surgical tools, the generator we'd spent 9 days repairing, the solar panels Kira had mounted on the south wing. 41 days of work, of fortification, of convincing ourselves we'd found something permanent gone. In a structural failure that had nothing to do with the infected and everything to do with a foundation that couldn't bear the weight of barricades we'd stacked too high. My fault. I'm the one who approved the reinforcement plan. I'm the one who said the ground floor could hold another layer of concrete debris without compromising the load-bearing walls. I was wrong. And now St. Michael's was a tomb for everything we'd built. The 14 of us stood on that rooftop in late October air that smelled like dust and something sweeter beneath it. That cloying smell you learn to recognize as the early decay of infection. Below us, drawn by the sound of collapse, the first ones appeared. They came from doorways and alleys and from beneath vehicles where they'd been waiting in that terrible dormant stillness. Dozens at first, then more. Their movement was wrong in the way it always was. Too fluid for their broken bodies, joints bending at angles that made your brain reject what your eyes reported. "We need to move," said Kira. She was already shouldering her pack, her dark eyes scanning the streets below for a gap in the converging bodies. Kira never panicked. In 7 weeks of surviving together, I'd never once seen her freeze. The group fragmented immediately, not by choice, but by the geometry of escape. The parking structure had 2 stairwells. The infected reached the eastern one before we did. That split us. 9 people went west, 5 of us went north, dropping from the structure's 2nd level onto an adjacent building's flat roof. 5 of us. Marcus Chen, 46, former high school principal who'd become our logistics coordinator through sheer organizational compulsion. Kira Okonkwo, 32, mechanical engineer, the person who made broken things functional again. Davis Wheeler, 58, retired military, quiet in a way that had grown quieter as the weeks progressed. Nina Castellano, 25, who'd been a veterinary technician before the outbreak and was now the closest thing we had to a doctor. And me, Eli Brandt, 37, a civil engineer, the man who'd just collapsed a hospital with bad math. We ran across 3 connected rooftops before finding a fire escape that descended into an alley clear of movement. Davis went first, his combat boots barely making sound on the rusted metal stairs. The rest followed in the order Kira established with hand signals. She and Marcus had developed a silent communication system in the early weeks that the rest of us had learned through necessity. At the alley floor, pressed against damp brick, we could hear them on the street beyond the shuffle, the click of jaws working involuntarily, that wet sound of heads turning in unison when stimulus registered. "Which direction?" Nina breathed against my ear. I pulled the folded city map from my jacket. Marked on it in red were the locations we'd already tried and lost. The pharmacy on 7th, the school gymnasium, the warehouse district, the hospital, red marks spreading across paper like the infection spreading across the city. But there, in the southeastern quadrant, unmarked and unvisited, sat a neighborhood I'd surveyed 4 years ago for a development project that never materialized. And beneath it, something the city had buried in paperwork and forgotten. "Southeast," I said. "I know a place." We moved through the city the way water moves through cracked stone, finding gaps, seeping through spaces too narrow or too dark for the infected to monitor. The first 3 blocks were the worst. The collapse of St. Michael's had stirred every dormant body in a half-mile radius, and the streets pulsed with their movement. Davis led with a silence that bordered on supernatural. 20 years in the Army had taught him how to distribute his weight across broken ground without generating sound. And we followed his footsteps, precisely stepping where he stepped, pausing where he paused. Once, he held up a closed fist, and we froze mid-stride while a cluster of 8 infected crossed an intersection 20 feet ahead. They moved together in that unsettling coordination, not quite a pack, but connected by some invisible signal that directed them as a unit. When they passed, Davis waited a full 60 seconds before moving again. I counted each one against the hammering of my pulse. Marcus struggled. His left knee had been problematic since week 2 when he'd fallen during a supply run, and the sustained movement without rest was grinding him down. Kira positioned herself beside him without being asked, one hand hovering near his elbow, ready to support without slowing us. 3 more blocks, I whispered when we paused behind a delivery truck that had jackknifed across a narrow street, creating a barrier the infected hadn't bothered to navigate around. The old Millhaven neighborhood. There's a decommissioned water pumping station on Archer Street. "What's special about it?" Nina asked. She was checking Marcus's knee by touch in the darkness, her veterinary training translating to human anatomy with practiced ease. "Nothing. That's the point." I pulled my memory together, the survey I'd conducted in 2022. The files I'd reviewed. The municipal records that told a story nobody cared about. In 1974, the city approved an underground parking structure beneath what was supposed to become a mixed-use development. They dug the foundation, poured the garage level, then the developer defaulted. The project died. The city sealed the entrance, built the pumping station over the access point as part of a utility project in '81. And the garage disappeared from every planning document after '93. "How do you know it's still intact?" Kira asked. Her engineering mind demanded evidence. "Because I found the original structural drawings when I surveyed the area. The pour was deep, reinforced concrete, designed to support a 12-story building above it. It's overbuilt for what it is. And the pumping station's basement connects directly to the garage's service ramp." "You never mentioned this before," Marcus said, and there was something in his voice, not accusation, but the recognition that I'd held information in reserve. It never seemed necessary before. We had the hospital. The statement hung between us. We had the hospital because I'd said the hospital was safe. Now we didn't have the hospital because I'd been wrong about load tolerances. Nobody said this aloud, but I felt it in the brief silence that followed. "Can you find it in the dark?" Davis asked. No judgment, just tactical assessment. "Yes." We moved again. The southeastern blocks were quieter residential neighborhoods that had emptied early in the outbreak, their populations having fled to the highways that became parking lots, then graveyards. Houses stood dark and hollow, front doors open like mouths mid-sentence. Lawns had grown wild over 2 months, sidewalks cracked by root systems, and neglect. The infected here were sparse and scattered. We passed 3 dormant figures standing in a yard motionless among overgrown grass, their faces turned toward something imperceptible. Davis altered our route to give them wide berth, and they remained still as we ghosted past. Archer Street appeared exactly as I remembered it from my survey, a dead-end road terminating at a chain-link fence behind which sat a squat concrete building with no windows and a steel door marked Municipal Water Services. "That's it," I said. "The way down." Kira studied the building with practiced assessment. "Let's see if it's as forgotten as you think." The padlock on the chain-link gate was rusted shut, not broken, not cut, but seized by years of oxidation and neglect. Davis produced a multi-tool and worked the hasp pins free instead, lifting the entire latch assembly off the fence post. The gate swung inward on hinges that protested with a sound we all winced at. We waited, listened. The clicking that characterized infected awareness didn't materialize. Only wind through tall grass and the distant, ever-present ambient noise of a city decomposing. The pumping station's steel door had a municipal lock, heavy duty, but standard issue for city utility buildings. I'd handled hundreds of identical locks during my career. The keyway was pin tumbler, 5-pin, and corroded enough that Davis's multi-tool, combined with a tension wrench I carried in my survey kit, defeated it in under 2 minutes. Inside, the pumping station smelled of machine oil and standing water. Our flashlights, 3 among 5 people, revealed industrial equipment that hadn't operated in years. Pumps stood silent, their housings coated in dust so thick it had become geological. Control panels displayed dead gauges and disconnected wiring. "Basement access?" Kira asked, already scanning the floor for hatches or stairwells. I found it against the rear wall, a metal staircase descending through a square opening in the concrete floor. The stairs were steel grating, industrial rated, bolted directly into the foundation. They led down into absolute darkness. We descended carefully, the sound of our footsteps on metal grating uncomfortably loud in the enclosed space. The staircase dropped 15 feet into a basement level that mirrored the pumping station's footprint, above perhaps 1,000 square feet of mechanical space. Pipes ran along the ceiling, and defunct equipment lined the walls. But there, on the eastern wall, exactly where the 1974 structural drawings indicated, a concrete archway leading to a descending ramp. The ramp was wide 12 feet across, designed for vehicle access. It sloped downward at a gentle 5-degree grade, curving left before disappearing beyond our light. Nina made a sound, half gasp, half laugh. "It's real." "Of course it's real," I said, though relief was crashing through me with force enough to weaken my knees. I read the drawings. We followed the ramp down. The air changed as we descended, growing cooler, drier, carrying that particular stillness of enclosed underground spaces. No smell of decay, no organic decomposition, just concrete and time. The ramp leveled out 30 feet below street level, and our flashlight beams entered a space so large they couldn't map its boundaries. Concrete pillars appeared in regular formation, massive square columns supporting a ceiling that stretched beyond visibility. The floor was clean concrete, unmarked by anything except decades of undisturbed dust. Davis swept his light in a systematic arc. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. The space was empty, with the absolute certainty of a place that hadn't been entered by any living thing since the last worker had left decades ago. "How big?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying echo in the vast space. "The drawings indicated capacity for 160 vehicles," I said, "roughly 35,000 square feet." Kira was already moving along the nearest wall, her engineer's hands running across the concrete surface. "No moisture intrusion," she reported. "No efflorescence, no cracking. This is exceptional construction." "Overbuilt," I repeated. Designed to carry 12 stories, it's holding up nothing but 6 feet of earth and a parking lot. We stood in silence for a moment that felt ceremonial. 5 people in an underground cathedral that the city had simply forgotten. Above us, the infected owned the streets, the buildings, the night. They owned the hospitals and the schools and the warehouses. They owned every place we'd tried to make ours. But they didn't own this. They couldn't own what they couldn't find. And this existed in no database, on no map, in no memory, except the files of a civil engineer who'd read structural drawings nobody else had bothered to open. "Home," Nina said softly. The word felt dangerous, but none of us corrected her. The first 72 hours underground were pure function assessment, organization, securing. We operated on adrenaline and the manic energy of relief, sleeping in shifts of 2 hours maximum while the others worked. I cataloged structural elements obsessively, measuring pillar spacing and wall thickness with the tools from my survey kit. The garage was a single-level rectangular space with the vehicle ramp as its sole designed entrance. But I found 3 other features. A stairwell shaft in the northeastern corner that had been sealed at the top during construction, filled with poured concrete that created an impenetrable plug. 2 ventilation shafts, each 8 inches in diameter, that rose vertically to surface level. Too narrow for anybody, living or dead, to navigate. Their upper openings, I later confirmed, emerged inside concrete utility boxes in the abandoned parking lot above, invisible to casual observation. Kira assessed the ventilation immediately. "Passive convection," she concluded after holding a lighter to one shaft and watching the flame dance. "Temperature differential creates airflow. It's minimal but constant. Enough for 5 people, probably up to 8 or 9 before CO2 becomes a concern." "What about cooking? Fire?" Tomas asked. We'd salvaged a small camp stove during our escape. The exhaust shaft draws adequately for contained flames. Small cooking, heating water manageable. Not bonfires. Marcus designated zones with the administrative precision that defined his personality. Sleeping area against the western wall, farthest from the ramp entrance. Supply storage along the south wall. Water collection beneath the ventilation shafts, where condensation gathered in the cooler underground air. A planning space near the ramp base where we could discuss operations without disturbing sleepers. Davis secured the ramp. He worked alone for most of the first day, constructing what he called a denial corridor. Debris arranged in staggered rows along the curved ramp, forcing any approaching body into a zigzag pattern that eliminated straight-line speed. At the bottom, where the ramp met the garage floor, he positioned our heaviest salvaged items as a final barrier. An overturned steel workbench, concrete blocks, a fire door we'd removed from the pumping station basement using Kira's tools. "Nothing's coming down that ramp fast," he reported, "and nothing's coming down quiet." Nina organized our medical supplies, tragically diminished from the hospital's loss. 2 bottles of broad-spectrum antibiotics, a partial course of antivirals, bandages, suture materials she'd grabbed during our evacuation. Enough to handle minor injuries. Not enough for anything serious. "We need more," she said flatly during our first planning meeting. "Within 2 weeks, we'll need a supply run for medical basics alone." "Noted," Mara said. "But we stabilize first. No runs until we understand our environment." The environment revealed itself gradually. Through our ventilation shafts, we could hear the surface muffled, translated by distance but present. During daylight hours, the sounds were scattered. Occasional infected movement, wind, the settling of structures losing their battle against entropy. At night, the activity above intensified. The infected moved more densely after dark, their clicking and shuffling creating a constant ambient layer that filtered down to us like rain through soil. "They don't know we're here," I confirmed after monitoring for 2 full days. "The shaft openings are too small to transmit our sound meaningfully, and the thermal signature is dispersed through concrete before it reaches surface level." "So we're invisible," Marcus said. "Acoustically and thermally, yes, as long as we control our surface activity." That phrase, surface activity, became our central operational concept. Everything we did above ground had to be calculated against the risk of revelation. We could enter and exit through the pumping station, but only with extreme caution, limited frequency, and absolute noise discipline. Kira suggested something during our second evening meeting that shaped everything that followed. We should establish communication with other survivors. Not immediately, but eventually. We have space. We have security. We could expand. Davis shook his head. More people means more noise, more surface movement, more risk. More hands, Kira countered. More skills, more sustainability. The debate had begun, and like most debates that matter, it wouldn't end cleanly. On our 5th day underground, I went above for the first time since our arrival. The purpose was reconnaissance, mapping the immediate area for resources and threats. Davis accompanied me, moving with that uncanny silence while the others remained below. Dawn was just beginning to separate sky from building silhouettes when we emerged from the pumping station. The air above hit different after days underground, organic, complex, carrying the accumulated scent of a city that no longer maintained itself. Rotting vegetation from unkempt lawns, the distant petroleum smell of leaking vehicles, and beneath everything, faint but unmistakable, the sweet, sick odor of infected bodies. Davis pointed southeast. 2 blocks away, a cluster of dormant infected stood in the middle of an intersection, perhaps 15 of them, arranged in a loose circle facing inward, heads slightly bowed. The dawn light caught them in silhouette, and the tableau was almost religious. A congregation of the broken, waiting for a sermon that would come as signal rather than sound. We avoided them by 3 blocks, moving northwest through residential streets where houses gaped open and empty. I noted potential resource locations, a hardware store with its loading bay door intact, suggesting unlooted interior. A pharmacy that had been partially raided, but might still contain overlooked supplies. A sporting goods store whose reinforced security shutters remained closed. "Everything we need is within a 5-block radius," I told Davis as we crouched behind a brick garden wall. "If we plan our runs carefully, small groups, pre-dawn timing, specific objectives, we can supply ourselves indefinitely." Davis was watching something I hadn't seen. His attention fixed on a house across the street, 2-story colonial. White paint peeling, front door ajar. After 10 seconds, I saw it. Movement in an upper window. Not infected movement. Too purposeful, too contained. "Someone's in there," he murmured. My pulse spiked. "Survivor? Watching us." Davis turned his body to appear non-threatening, a deliberate military posture adjustment that communicated peaceful intent to anyone with training. Could be a threat, could be an asset. A face appeared briefly in the window, dark skin, close-cropped hair, eyes that caught the growing light before withdrawing. A woman, I thought, alert and intentional. "Do we make contact?" I asked. "Not today. We mark the location, report back, decide as a group." Davis moved us away from the sight line, and we continued our survey without looking back. When we returned underground, an hour later, with hand-drawn maps and resource assessments. The others listened carefully. The news about the watcher in the window generated immediate division. "We should approach them," Kira said. "If they're alone and surviving, they might have information, skills. They might need help." "Or they might follow us back," Marcus countered. "Track where we enter, compromise our location." "She didn't seem hostile," Davis offered. "Cautious, observant, but not aggressive." "She?" Nina asked. "Appeared female. Couldn't determine age or condition at distance." We debated for an hour, our longest group discussion since arriving. The fundamental tension was clear. Kira saw other survivors as potential community, resources to integrate. Marcus saw them as variables that threatened operational security. Davis maintained neutrality, presenting tactical considerations without advocacy. Nina leaned toward contact, citing the medical benefit of additional people who might carry supplies or knowledge. I found myself torn. The engineer in me understood closed systems. They were calculable, controllable. Open systems introduced chaos, but closed systems also stagnated. They consumed their resources without replenishment and eventually failed through exhaustion rather than breach. "We table it for now," I suggested. "Monitor the location during future runs. If she's still there in a week, if she appears stable, we reassess." The compromise satisfied no one. Fully the mark of an effective middle ground. But it established a pattern that would define our underground governance. Decisions by discussion, mediated by patience. No single authority. That night, I lay awake thinking about the face in the window, about what it meant that someone else was surviving in our neighborhood, about whether our forgotten space could remain forgotten with witnesses present. Yuki found us on the 9th day, not through tracking or investigation, through desperation. We'd been running our morning ventilation check, opening the damper system Kira had calibrated to regulate airflow, when Marcus heard it. A voice, thin and strained, filtering through the northeast shaft. "Please, if anyone's down there, please." We froze. The voice was female, young, barely louder than the wind. It could have been hallucination, confined spaces, and stress-produced phantom sounds. But Marcus heard it again, and then so did I. "Someone's at the surface vent," Marcus said, his face draining of color. "They know we're here." Panic is a physical thing underground. It has nowhere to disperse, no horizon to dissipate against. It bounces off walls and concentrates. I felt it spreading through the group like temperature change. "Everyone quiet," Davis commanded, and his military authority cut through the fear instantly. He moved to the shaft base, tilting his head to listen. The voice came again. "I can hear the air. I know someone's there. I'm alone. I'm hurt. 3 days without water." Davis looked at me. The decision weight in his gaze was crushing. "If we don't respond, she dies," Nina said. "If she's at the vent, she's already close to us. She'll die against our air shaft." "If we respond, we expose ourselves," Marcus said. "She's already found the shaft," Kira pointed out. "The secret's compromised either way. The question is whether we manage the situation or let it manage us." I made the call. I don't know why it was mine to make, perhaps because the guilt of the hospital still pressed on me, and I couldn't carry another death of inaction. Davis and I go up. Nina, prepare medical. Everyone else, defensive positions on the ramp. We exited through the pumping station and circled to the parking lot above the garage. In the early morning light, we found her crouched against one of the concrete utility boxes that housed our ventilation shaft opening. She was small, maybe 5'4", wearing clothes too thin for the October air, with a makeshift bandage around her left hand that had soaked through with brownish red. When she saw us, she didn't run. She raised her uninjured hand slowly. "I'm Yuki," she said. "I was in the house on Belmont. I saw you 5 days ago." The woman from the window. "They came 3 nights back, a swarm. I got out through the basement, but I couldn't. I've been moving since, following the air coming from the ground. It smelled like people. She'd tracked us by scent carried through our ventilation. The realization was terrifying in its implication. If she could detect our presence through the shafts, others might too." Davis assessed her wound before anything else. "Show me the hand." She unwrapped the bandage. "A deep laceration across her palm glass," she explained, "from breaking a window during her escape. No bite, no scratch marks consistent with infected contact." Davis confirmed with clinical detachment. Clean wound edges, no surrounding discoloration, no fever visible in her complexion. "Not infected," he reported. I made the second decision of that morning. She comes below. We treat the wound. Then we talk. Marcus objected silently, through posture rather than words, but didn't contradict me. We led Yuki through the pumping station, down the stairs, through the basement, and into the ramp. Her reaction to the garage space was what ours had been. Stunned relief, followed by tears she tried to hide. Nina cleaned and sutured her hand with a competence that erased any boundary between veterinary and human medicine. Yuki sat still throughout, watching the procedure with analytical focus despite what must have been considerable pain. "How many of you?" she asked when Nina finished. "5, I said. "6 now, if you're staying." "I'm staying?" No hesitation. "And I can tell you, the infected are changing their behavior. Their dormant patterns are shifting. Clusters are growing larger. Something's coordinating them more tightly than before." She was a biologist, and she'd been watching them from that house for 9 days, with nothing else to do. Our closed system had just opened. The question was whether it would strengthen or collapse. Yuki's integration changed our dynamics more than her single presence should have warranted. She brought information dense, observed, analytical, and information was currency we'd been operating without. Over the next 3 days, she shared what she'd cataloged from her elevated vantage point on Belmont Street. The infected weren't simply wandering or clustering randomly. They were aggregating in patterns that repeated on roughly 48-hour cycles. Dispersal during early morning, gradual collection toward afternoon, dense clustering by nightfall, peak density between 2 and 4 a.m., followed by another dispersal at dawn. "Circadian," Kira said when Yuki presented her observations with diagrams drawn on the backs of salvaged paper. "They're following a light cycle." "Not exactly," Yuki corrected. "The timing correlates with light, but the trigger is temperature. They cluster as ambient temperature drops. When it rises, they scatter. I tested it on warmer nights. Clustering happened later and dispersed earlier." "They're cold-seeking?" Nina asked. Her clinical mind engaging. "Warmth avoidant. They move away from heat sources and aggregate in cooler areas. That's why they fill intersections and open spaces at night. Those are the coldest points in an urban environment. Buildings retain warmth. Open air loses it fastest." The implications cascaded through my engineering brain immediately. "We're underground," I said. "Thermally stable. The garage maintains roughly 55 degrees regardless of surface conditions. Which means you radiate no detectable thermal signature," Yuki confirmed. "Your ventilation shafts might emit marginal warmth during the day, when surface air is cooler than underground air. but the differential is negligible. You're thermally invisible. Relief, but also a new understanding of threat. If the infected were thermal avoidant, and our shafts occasionally emitted warmer air, we were safe. But if surface temperatures dropped enough deep winter, sustained cold, the thermal differential would increase. Our shafts would become warmer relative to their surroundings. Detectable. Winter, I said. The word settled over the group. We have roughly 6 weeks before sustained freezing temperatures, Marcus calculated. Maybe 8 in a mild year. I can engineer baffles for the shafts, Kira said immediately. Thermal barriers that allow airflow but dissipate heat before it reaches the surface. Give me materials and a week. Materials means surface runs, Davis noted. Then we plan surface runs. We began planning that afternoon. Davis and I mapped routes to the hardware store I'd identified, calculating approach vectors that avoided the cluster patterns Yuki had documented. The store sat outside any consistent aggregation zone. Its location on a south-facing slope meant it retained heat longer than surrounding areas, keeping infected at distance during their clustering hours. Our window would be pre-dawn, after the peak clustering dispersed, but before full daylight made us visible to any infected, still in transition. A 90-minute operational window. Davis estimated we could reach the store, load supplies, and return within 60 minutes if we moved with purpose. 2-person team, he said. Speed over capacity. Multiple small runs rather than one large exposure. I want to go, Yuki said. The group turned to her. Her hand was still bandaged, still healing. I know their movement patterns from observation. I can navigate by their behavior in real time. Your hand, Nina began, is my left. I'm right-handed. And I'm faster than anyone here except Davis. She wasn't wrong. At 27, former collegiate track athlete turned research biologist, she moved with an efficiency of motion that surpassed our group's average significantly. Davis appraised her with the steady evaluation he applied to everything. We test you first. Tomorrow morning, you move with me in the parking lot above. I assess your noise discipline, speed, awareness. If you pass, you run. Deal. That night, I listened to the surface sounds through our ventilation shafts with new comprehension. The clicking and shuffling above wasn't random, it was organized by physics. Temperature gradients moving bodies like currents moving water. The infected weren't hunting us. They were flowing along thermodynamic paths, and we happened to exist in the spaces between those paths, for now. Yuki passed Davis's assessment. She moved better than he'd expected. Her athletic background translated directly into the kind of controlled, deliberate locomotion that surface operations demanded. The two of them returned from the parking lot test with Davis wearing what passed for approval on his usually expressionless face. She's good, he told me privately. Instinctive threat awareness. Doesn't panic move. The first supply run launched 2 mornings later. Davis and Yuki, departure at 5:15 a.m. Target the hardware store on Morrison. The rest of us waited underground, monitoring surface sounds through the shafts. Marcus had positioned himself at the northeast vent with a watch, timing their absence against the 60-minute operational window. They returned in 43 minutes, carrying 2 bags of materials: insulation foam, metal ducting, sealant tape, a battery-powered drill, fasteners, and unexpectedly a hand-crank radio that Kira nearly wept over when she saw it. Found it in the back office, Davis said, still in packaging. The radio changed everything. Not immediately, the first hours of scanning produced only static across all frequencies. But on the second day of patient rotation through AM and FM bands, Marcus caught something on 1620 AM. A recorded loop, automated, broadcasting from what sounded like a government emergency station. The message was clinical and devastating. Recorded 2 weeks after the outbreak's beginning, never updated. It instructed citizens to proceed to designated evacuation zones, locations we knew had been overrun within days of the recording. It provided no survival information, no updates on military response, no indication that anyone in authority was still operating. But its existence meant the broadcast infrastructure still functioned somewhere. Power still reached a transmitter. The systems hadn't completely collapsed. If we could transmit, Kira mused, turning the radio over in her hands. Modify this to send rather than receive. We'd announce our location to everyone within range, Marcus said sharply, infected or otherwise. Radio doesn't attract them, Yuki interjected. They respond to thermal signatures and physical vibrations sound through surfaces. Radio waves don't register. I wasn't talking about infected, Marcus replied. I was talking about people. People with weapons and fewer principles than us. The hardware store people from my earlier reconnaissance flashed through my mind. The 4 armed survivors Kira's report know that was a different story. But Marcus's point stood regardless. Other survivors existed. We'd already confirmed at least the 1 cluster near our previous hospital location. People who'd survived this long had done so through aggression, hoarding, or both. The radio debate joined the growing list of unresolved tensions in our group. Kira pushed for communication, for community building, for expansion. Marcus resisted anything that threatened our operational security. Davis remained neutral. Nina supported Kira's position from a medical perspective. More people meant more distributed knowledge, more hands for care. Yuki, still new to our dynamics, observed without committing. And me, I remained the structural engineer, thinking always in terms of load-bearing capacity. How much weight could our group sustain before the joints failed? We'd started at 5, now 6. Each addition increased both capability and stress. There was a maximum beyond which community became crowd, and crowd became liability. Table the radio discussion, I suggested. Focus on Kira's thermal baffles. That's our immediate survival priority. Agreement came reluctantly from all directions, the compromise of delay rather than resolution. But it bought time, and time underground was our most renewable resource. Kira began work on the ventilation baffles that evening, using materials from the hardware run. Her engineering mind solved the problem elegantly, alternating layers of insulation and metal ducting that created a thermal labyrinth air could pass through. But heat dissipated across each layer, reaching the surface at near ambient temperature regardless of the underground differential. 2 weeks to install all 3 shafts, she estimated. 1 more hardware run for additional materials. Scheduled for Thursday, Davis confirmed. We were building something, not just to shelter a system. An organism with circulation and defenses and a metabolism measured in supply runs and caloric consumption. The question that kept me awake was whether organisms this small could sustain themselves, or whether survival demanded growth. Growth meant risk. Stasis meant slow depletion. Neither option was safe. The second hardware run went wrong in a way that reshaped our understanding of threat. Davis and Yuki departed at the usual pre-dawn hour. Kira needed additional ducting and a specific gauge of metal sheeting for the second ventilation baffle. The run should have been routine, same route, same timing, same store. They didn't return within the 60-minute window. At 70 minutes, Marcus began pacing. At 80, Nina positioned herself at the ramp base with our first aid supplies visible. At 95 minutes, I was preparing to break protocol and go above. When the pumping station door signal came 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks. They were running when I opened the basement door. Not from infected, from humans. Davis had blood on his temple, a shallow cut above his right eyebrow. Yuki was uninjured but shaking with adrenaline. 3 men, Davis reported once we'd sealed ourselves below. Inside the store. Weren't there before? They'd set up between our runs, sleeping bags, supplies, weapons. They woke when we entered. Armed, Marcus demanded. Machetes. One had a crossbow. They didn't fire, they demanded we drop what we carried and leave. So you fought them? I asked, looking at Davis's wound. No, I dropped the materials, started backing out. Then one of them grabbed Yuki. His jaw tightened. I intervened, got hit, we ran. Yuki confirmed. The one who grabbed me, he wasn't trying to kill me. He was trying to hold me, keep me. The implication of that sentence moved through the group like ice water. Did they follow you? Kira asked, her voice taut. I ran a counter-surveillance route, Davis said. 4 direction changes, doubled back twice, watched for 20 minutes from elevation. No pursuit. But they know people are operating in this area now, Marcus said. They know someone wanted hardware supplies. They might watch the store. They might patrol. They might find the pumping station, I added. The thought tightened my throat. We spent the next hour in threat assessment, the most intense tactical discussion we'd had since arriving. Davis drew movement patterns on our planning surface, marking the hardware store's location relative to the pumping station. 3 blocks separated them, close enough that persistent surveillance from the store could theoretically detect our entrance patterns. We need an alternate entry, I said. The engineer's solution, another path, a bypass. If the pumping station is compromised, we need a second way in. The sealed stairwell, Kira suggested immediately. Northeast corner. You said it was plugged with concrete at the top. It is. But concrete can be removed from above if we locate the surface point and work at night. That takes days of surface work, Davis pointed out. Noise, exposure. Not necessarily, Kira said. She was already calculating. If the stairwell shaft rises straight up, which it should, given construction standards, it terminates somewhere beneath the abandoned parking lot above us. If I can determine the exact surface location, I can assess whether we can access it quietly. The technical discussion continued, but my mind was circling something larger. Other survivors had moved into our operational radius. They were aggressive, territorial, willing to use violence. Our anonymity, our primary defense, now had a crack in it. Not from infected, not from structural failure, but from human competition. That evening, I sat with Davis on watch at the ramp base. His head wound was superficial. Nina had closed it with butterfly bandages, but his demeanor had shifted. The military stillness that usually read as calm now read as alert. What aren't you telling me? I asked. He was quiet for a long time. Then, the one with the crossbow. He was wearing a corrections uniform shirt. Prison guard. Or prisoner. Either way, someone from the correctional facility on the east side. That place held 300 inmates when the outbreak hit. If even a fraction survived and organized... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We weren't competing with 3 desperate men in a hardware store. We were potentially competing with an organized, violent, trained group who knew how to control people and territory. Our forgotten garage had just become a secret worth keeping with our lives. Winter arrived in a single night, not gradually, but as a wall of cold that dropped temperatures 30 degrees between sunset and dawn. We felt it underground as a change in air pressure against our skin, the ventilation shafts drawing harder as the thermal differential increased between our stable 55 degrees and the plummeting surface temperature. Kira had completed 2 of 3 baffle installations. The third shaft, our primary air intake on the northwest side, remained unmodified. She'd run out of metal sheeting on the interrupted second hardware run, and no one had proposed returning to Morrison Street since the encounter. "I need that material," Kira said on the morning after the first freeze. Her voice carried unusual urgency. "Without the third baffle, we're venting detectable warmth from the northwest shaft. When surface temperature drops below freezing, that shaft will read as a thermal anomaly to anything that senses heat differential." "The infected sense it," Yuki confirmed. "They won't be attracted to the warmth, but they'll avoid it, creating a visible void in their clustering patterns, a circle of absence around the shaft that anyone observant, human or otherwise, could notice." "A footprint," I said. "Exactly. An invisible shelter leaving a visible footprint." We had to resolve the material shortage. The hardware store was compromised. We needed alternatives. I spread my survey memory across the group like a map. Every building in a 10-block radius that I'd cataloged during our initial reconnaissance, searching for structures that might contain metal sheeting, ductwork, construction materials. Nina offered an unexpected answer. "The veterinary clinic on Redford," she said. "The building I worked in before the outbreak. It has a commercial HVAC system rooftop units with metal ducting throughout the ceiling space, and it's locked with a code I know." "Distance?" Davis asked. 6 blocks south, past the cluster intersection Yuki documented. "That intersection is clear during pre-dawn dispersal," Yuki said, consulting her pattern notes. "Window of approximately 20 minutes between 3:45 and 4:05 a.m. when the thermal aggregation releases." 20 minutes to cross one intersection. It seemed absurd, the geometry of fear reducing speed to crawl. But absurdity was our operating reality. We planned the run for the following morning. This time, 3 went. Davis, Yuki, and Nina for building access and knowledge of the ductwork layout. Marcus argued against sending 3 people, but the logic was sound. Nina reduced time inside the target, and Yuki's behavioral prediction capability offset the increased group size. I spent the waiting hour with Marcus and Kira underground, listening. The surface sounds had changed with cold. The infected made different noises in freezing temperatures. Their movements became more brittle, their jaw clicking sharper, as if the cold made their bodies louder through stiffness. The team returned in 51 minutes, carrying mastering rolled metal ducting sections and 2 sheet metal panels that Nina had removed from the clinic's HVAC ceiling runs. Enough material for Kira to complete the third baffle and have surplus for repairs. But Nina came back quiet. Not shaken quiet in a deeper way, a processing silence. "What happened?" I asked when the others dispersed to unload. "The clinic," she said. "My clinic. The animals were still in the boarding cages." She stopped speaking for a moment. "They'd been there since the outbreak. 2 months." I understood. In the chaos of evacuation, nobody had gone back for boarded pets. The clinic had been locked, sealed, forgotten, like our garage. But unlike our garage, it had contained living things that needed care. "They were gone," she said. "Long gone. But the cages were. They tried to get out." She didn't elaborate further, and I didn't ask. Some images embed themselves in memory with a permanence that retelling only strengthens. Nina carried her own weight of what the world had become, and she carried it privately. Kira installed the third baffle within 48 hours. When complete, She tested each shaft with a thermal sensor salvaged from the clinic's equipment. All three read within 2 degrees of ambient surface temperature at their outlets. We were invisible again. But the encounter with the armed men lingered like an unhealed bruise, pressing against every decision we made. Day 26 underground. We had settled into rhythm supply runs every 5 days, rotating personnel, systematic resource building. The garage had transformed from empty space into something approaching habitable. Kira had rigged a water collection system using condensation from the ventilation baffles. Tomas Frey still called the cooking zone Thomas's Corner, though that name belonged to a different story, a different group, a different collapse. Marcus managed our food supply, having established collection from 2 previously unlooted residences and a small grocery storage room that had been overlooked by earlier scavengers. We were surviving. The question nobody asked aloud was, for what? It was Yuki who broke that unspoken ceiling. She'd been monitoring infected behavior through the ventilation shafts, counting clustering patterns and timing cycles, filling notebooks with data that seemed academic until she presented her findings at our evening meeting. They're migrating, she said. Not randomly. The cluster sizes are growing in the eastern districts and shrinking in the west. They're moving toward something, or away from something. Which? Kira asked. Toward. The thermal patterns don't explain it. This is a behavioral shift independent of temperature. Something is drawing them eastward. What's east? Marcus asked. The river, the industrial district, the correctional facility. Davis said that last word with particular weight. You think the prison survivors are attracting them? I asked. If they're generating heat, noise, activity, yes, Yuki said. A large organized group creates thermal and acoustic signatures that propagate through the urban environment. The infected would respond to that like iron filings to a magnet. The implication was double-edged. If the infected were migrating east, our western position became safer. Fewer bodies in our vicinity, less chance of discovery. But a large organized group drawing infected toward itself would eventually either be overwhelmed or would push back, scattering the infected in unpredictable directions. We benefit short-term, I analyzed. Long-term, we're watching a pressure system build. When it releases either through the group failing or the infected mass redirecting the dispersal wave, will cover the entire city, including us. Pessimistic, Kira said. Realistic, Davis corrected. I've seen strongholds fail. When they go, everything inside scatters. People, threats, resources, all at once. Maximum chaos. So, what do we do? Nina asked. The answer, the honest one, was that we couldn't do anything about a distant pressure system building toward release. We could only prepare for the aftermath, strengthen our position, build redundancy into our survival systems, create the second entrance that had been discussed but not executed. That night, I made a decision that I didn't bring to the group. I went above alone, a violation of our protocol, and surveyed the parking lot surface for the stairwell shaft location. Using measurements from below and my knowledge of construction geometry, I identified the probable terminus beneath a section of cracked asphalt near the lot's eastern edge, against a retaining wall that provided visual cover. I cleared debris by hand in the dark, feeling the surface with my palms until I found it a slight depression in the asphalt, circular, approximately 4 feet in diameter. The concrete plug that sealed the shaft was directly below. If we could break through from above quietly over multiple nights, we'd have our emergency exit. I returned underground without telling anyone, planning to present the finding as a feasibility assessment rather than a unilateral scouting mission. The deception bothered me. 6 weeks earlier, I wouldn't have considered acting alone. But the hospital's collapse had changed something in my relationship with the group decision-making. I'd let consensus guide me before. And consensus had approved a barricade plan that destroyed everything. Sometimes one person's knowledge was more reliable than collective agreement. The engineer in me believed that. The human in me recognized it as the beginning of a dangerous isolation. I told Davis the next morning. Only Davis. His response was a single nod. "Show me tonight," he said. "We'll assess together." At least I wasn't entirely alone in it. Not yet. The stairwell project became our covert operation, Davis and I working after midnight in 2-hour shifts, chipping through asphalt and then concrete with hand tools wrapped in cloth to dampen sound. We told the others we were conducting perimeter surveys. The deception held for 4 nights. Kira caught us on the 5th. She'd noticed the fresh concrete dust on my boots, inconsistent with interior work. She waited until Davis and I returned one night, then met us at the ramp base, with crossed arms and a flashlight aimed directly at our faces. "What are you doing above that? Takes 2 hours and creates concrete dust." I could have lied. Davis wouldn't have contradicted whatever I said. His loyalty operated in straight lines. But lying to Kira violated something fundamental about what we'd built here. Our shelter functioned because trust functioned. Deceiving the group, even with good intentions, corroded that foundation. "Emergency exit," I said. "The sealed stairwell. We're breaking through from above." Her expression cycled through surprise, anger, and something more complex, a recognition perhaps, that she'd have done the same thing. Without telling us. "I should have told you. I'm telling you now." "You're telling me because I caught you." "Yes." She stood silently for a long moment. Then, "How far through are you?" 8 inches of asphalt cleared. Concrete plug begins below that. Based on the original drawings, the plug is 18 inches of standard mix. At our current rate, another 6 nights. "I can accelerate that. The battery drill from the hardware run. Diamond bit, low RPM. Generates less noise than impact tools if you apply consistent pressure." And just like that, the secret became a collaboration. Kira didn't demand we tell the others immediately. She understood the diplomatic complexity. Marcus would object to the resource expenditure. Nina would worry about the exposure. Yuki would calculate the behavioral risk of repeated surface presence. "We tell them when it's done," Kira decided. Accomplished fact is easier to accept than proposed risk. 3 of us working with better tools reduced the timeline dramatically. By night 8 of the project, we'd penetrated the concrete plug and exposed the top of the stairwell shaft. Cool air rose from below our garage atmosphere, confirming connection. Kira fashioned a temporary cover from sheet metal and debris, concealing the opening from casual surface observation. The exit was crude, a vertical shaft requiring ladder access, but functional. If the pumping station entrance was ever compromised, we could evacuate upward through the parking lot in under 3 minutes. We told the group on day 34. Marcus reacted exactly as predicted. Frustration at the secrecy, concern about protocol violation. But when he stood at the shaft's base and looked up at the circle of night sky visible above, his objection dissolved into grudging acknowledgement. "You should have told us," he said. "Yes," I agreed, "but it's necessary." "Yes." Nina's response was pragmatic. "Does this change our evacuation protocol?" Davis drafted a new emergency plan that evening, the first time he'd written anything since we'd arrived. 2 exit routes, predetermined rally points, dispersal patterns if group evacuation proved impossible. Yuki's response surprised me most. She climbed the ladder we'd rigged and spent 30 minutes at the surface exit, oriented north, watching the distant eastern sky, where faint lights suggested fire, something burning in the industrial district. "The pressure is building faster than I estimated," she reported when she descended. "There's active conflict east of the river. Fires. The infected clusters responding to them are massive. I counted 300 plus in a single aggregation visible from surface level. 300. The number was staggering. We'd been dealing with individual infected and small clusters. 300 organized bodies moving as a unit exceeded anything our shelter could survive if directed toward us. "How long?" I asked. "Before what?" "Before that pressure system breaks. Before whatever's building over there collapses and sends a wave in every direction." Yuki's face was impossible to read in the dim underground light. "Days," she said. "Maybe a week. Not longer." On day 37, the eastern sky burned red from dusk to dawn. Through our surface exit now, our observation point, we could see pillars of smoke rising from the industrial district 2 miles away. The fires weren't natural or accidental. They were too regular, too sustained. Something was being burned intentionally. "Defensive fires," Davis said, watching through a pair of binoculars Yuki had salvaged weeks earlier. "They're burning a perimeter. The group east is trying to create a barrier against the infected mass." "Will it work?" Nina asked. "No." Davis lowered the binoculars. "Fire creates updraft. Updraft changes thermal patterns. The infected will root around the heat, not through it. They'll find the gaps. They always find the gaps." Yuki's observations confirmed this over the next 48 hours. The infected clusters that had been migrating eastward began splitting, half continuing toward the fire source, drawn by whatever signal overrode their thermal avoidance, and half diverting north and south along the fire line's edges. The southern diversion track brought them closer to our position. Not immediately threatening, still 8 blocks distant, but the margin was shrinking. "We need to consider leaving," Marcus said during our emergency meeting on day 39. It was the first time he'd suggested abandoning the garage. His administrative mind had calculated. Shrinking safety margin, limited egress routes, 6 people with constrained mobility against potentially hundreds of redirected infected. "And go where?" Kira challenged. "This is the most secure position in the city. We have infrastructure, concealment, 2 exits, stored supplies. Anywhere else is starting from zero." "Anywhere else might not be in the path of a mass dispersal event," Marcus countered. "We don't know the dispersal pattern yet," Yuki argued. "It could redirect north instead of west. We could be outside the path entirely." "Could," Marcus repeated. "And if we're wrong?" The argument escalated in a way our previous disagreements hadn't. Marcus was afraid, genuinely afraid, in a way the garage's security had suppressed for weeks. That fear made him sharp, his words carrying edges. "We gambled on Eli's hospital. That collapsed. We gambled on this garage being forgotten. Now people know we're in this area. The infected are shifting toward us. At what point do we acknowledge that hiding underground isn't a permanent solution?" "No solution is permanent," I said. The words came out harder than I intended. Every position is temporary. Every shelter is borrowed time. The question isn't whether this place eventually fails, it's whether anywhere else offers better odds right now. "Right now is all we have," Marcus fired back. "Then right now, this is better. Steel doors, 30 feet of earth. 2 exits, thermal invisibility. Name a surface location within 50 miles that offers equivalent protection." He couldn't. None of us could. The garage's strengths were real and measurable. but so was the threat converging from the east and the uncertainty of its trajectory. We voted. First time we'd formally voted on anything. Davis abstained military instinct, rejecting democratic decision-making in tactical situations. Kira voted to stay. Marcus voted to leave. Nina voted to stay. Yuki voted to stay. I voted to stay. 4-1, 1 abstention. We stayed. Marcus accepted the result without further argument. But something shifted in him after that meeting. He withdrew from the communal energy, performing his duties: food management, scheduling, record-keeping with mechanical precision, but without the invested engagement that had characterized his earlier contributions. He was present in body and function, absent in commitment. I should have addressed it. A leader would have. But I wasn't a leader. I was a structural engineer who'd accidentally become a decision-maker because I understood the building we lived in. My authority extended to load-bearing walls and ventilation capacity, not to human hearts slowly separating from collective purpose. That night, the eastern fires intensified. The smoke changed direction with shifting wind, and for the first time, we smelled it underground, acrid, industrial, carrying chemicals that made our eyes water even through the baffled ventilation system. The pressure system was reaching critical mass. When it broke, it would break everything near it, including perhaps us. Day 41. I remember the exact moment the eastern collapse reached us, not because of any dramatic sound or visible event, but because of silence. I was on watch at the ramp base at 3:17 a.m. when the constant ambient sound from above, the clicking, shuffling, background noise of infected presence, simply stopped. Complete silence. No wind, no movement, no thermal cycle activity, as if someone had pressed mute on the world above. I signaled Davis awake. He joined me at the ramp, head tilted, listening with that trained awareness. "They're not there," he whispered. "I know." "Where did they go?" We woke the others. Yuki climbed to the surface exit and spent 10 minutes scanning before descending with a face I hadn't seen on her before. Not fear exactly, but awe at something too large to process. "They're gone," she said. "Every infected body within visible range is moving east at speed, running, all of them, like something called them." "The fires?" Kira asked. "The fires are out. I can't see smoke anymore. Whatever was east, whatever was burning, it's done. And now every infected within miles is converging on that point." "Converging on the remains," Davis translated. "The group there failed. The infected broke through, and now they're swarming the breach." The implications fractured in my mind. Hundreds, maybe thousands of infected, all concentrated at a single eastern point. Our neighborhood suddenly, miraculously empty. A window of safety we hadn't experienced since arriving. "We should use this," Kira said immediately. "Move supplies, reinforce, do everything we couldn't do with them present." "For how long?" Marcus asked. His voice was flat, uninvested but attentive. "How long until they disperse back?" "Unknown," Yuki admitted. "If the stimulus at the eastern point sustains, if there's enough thermal or acoustic signal from whatever's happening, they could cluster there for days, or they could disperse in hours. We decided to act on the opportunity regardless of duration. For the first time, all 6 of us went above simultaneously, spreading through the neighborhood in pairs to gather resources that had been too risky to approach before. Davis and Yuki hit the sporting goods store, the one with intact security shutters. Marcus and Nina went for pharmaceutical supplies from a clinic 3 blocks north that we'd identified but never reached. Kira and I carried materials for reinforcing the emergency exit into a more accessible passage. The The neighborhood was eerie in its emptiness. Streets that normally hosted scattered dormant figures were bare. Literally nothing moved except blowing debris. The absence of threat felt almost more disturbing than its presence. Like walking through a field you knew was mined, but couldn't see the devices. Kira and I worked on the exit shaft in full daylight for the first time, a luxury that felt transgressive. She designed a folding ladder system that could be deployed from below and retracted once everyone was through, leaving no evidence of the shaft's functionality from the surface. "If we'd had this from the beginning," she said, bolting brackets into the shaft wall, "everything would have been easier." "If we'd had this from the beginning, we wouldn't have needed it," I replied. "The threat drives the innovation." She smiled without looking up. The engineer's optimism. The engineer's pragmatism. We completed the work in 2 hours, openly, efficiently, without the furtive night work that had characterized the project's first phase. When we descended, the garage felt different. 2 functional exits, reinforced barriers, stored supplies. 6 people who understood their environment and each other. But as the day progressed and we gathered our individual halls underground, a sound returned to the ventilation shafts, distant at first, then growing. Not the usual scattered ambient noise. Something heavier, more unified. A sound like weather approaching continuous, undifferentiated, filling the frequency spectrum. The swarm was dispersing. And it was dispersing in every direction. "Close the dampers," I ordered. Kira sealed all 3 shafts. We sat in darkness and waited for the wave to pass over us. The sound lasted 11 hours. 11 hours of continuous movement above us, thousands of infected bodies dispersing from the eastern collapse point, flowing through every available street and path like water released from a burst dam. They moved across our parking lot, over our sealed ventilation shafts, past our pumping station entrance, through every gap and corridor in the urban landscape. Kira's baffles held. No thermal signature escaped. Our dampers sealed the acoustic path. We sat 30 feet below a river of the dead, and they didn't know we existed. But the experience changed something in each of us. 11 hours of listening to that sound, not clicking or shuffling, but the sustained thunder of mass movement, left psychological marks that manifested differently in each person. Marcus grew quieter still. Nina held her hands clasped tight for hours, controlling the trembling that threatened to become audible. Yuki wrote furiously in her notebook, processing through analysis, filling pages with density estimates and speed calculations. Kira sat perfectly still with her eyes closed, conserving energy with an engineer's efficiency. Davis positioned himself at the ramp base, weapon ready, facing the door prepared for a breach that would mean death for all of us. I paced. 4 steps forward, 4 steps back. The contained energy of a man who built things unable to build anything against this. My domain was structure and stress, the mechanics of materials under load. But the load pressing against us now wasn't measurable in pounds per square foot. It was measured in bodies per block, and no calculation I could perform would reduce it. When the sound finally diminished gradually, over the course of an hour, the silence that replaced it felt fundamentally different from any silence before. This wasn't absence of noise. It was aftermath. The city above had been scoured by passage, and whatever remained was what the flood had left behind. We waited another 4 hours before opening the dampers. Fresh air entered cold, carrying the smell of turned earth and something organic that wasn't decay exactly but felt biological. A pheromone trace, maybe. The scent trail of thousands of bodies. Davis went above first. He was gone 20 minutes, the longest solo surface excursion any of us had undertaken. When he returned, his expression was unreadable. "The pumping station is intact," he reported. "No structural damage, no infected present within visual range. But the landscape has changed." "Changed how?" I asked. Vehicles moved, fencing torn down. Small structures, sheds, bus shelters, anything lightweight displaced or destroyed. "The dormant infected are gone, completely gone. The neighborhood is empty." "Empty as in safe, or empty as in stripped?" Yuki asked. "Both. There's nothing here to attract them back. No thermal sources, no movement, nothing living visible for blocks. We're in a dead zone now." A dead zone. The phrase carried weight beyond its tactical meaning. We'd chosen this location for its forgettability, and now it had been rendered even more absent. No infected, no other survivors, no activity. A void in the city's new ecosystem. "That's good," Nina said carefully. "Right? That's what we wanted. Invisibility." "It's good until we need to eat," Marcus said. The first meaningful contribution he'd made in 3 days. "The residences we were collecting from, if the dispersal wave stripped them, carried debris inside, we've lost our food sources." I looked at Kira. She looked at Davis. We all understood. The wave that had passed over us might have protected us physically while destroying us logistically. If our supply radius had been emptied, not just of infected, but of accessible resources, our sustainable position became untenable without expanding our range significantly. "Assessment run tomorrow," I said. "Full team, spread pattern, catalog what's left." Nods around the circle. United in this, at least the immediate need to understand our new reality. That night, for the first time since arriving underground, I dreamed. Not of the infected, not of the hospital collapsing, but of the garage itself empty, silent, stretching infinitely in all directions, and me walking through it alone, calling names that echoed back unanswered. The assessment revealed a landscape transformed. The dispersal wave had rewritten our operational environment with the indifference of a natural disaster. Vehicles that had blocked intersections for months were pushed aside or overturned. Fences and barriers lay flat. Building facades on ground floors showed impact damage where the massive bodies had pressed against them like a living current. But the supplies we needed, food, medicine, tools, remained largely intact inside structures the infected had flowed around rather than through. They'd followed streets, paths of least resistance, and buildings that were sealed had been bypassed like boulders in a river. The sporting goods store Davis and Yuki had opened during the brief clear window was an exception. Its security shutters had been torn free by the mass of bodies pressing against them, and the interior was ransacked by momentum rather than intent. But the grocery storage room Marcus had identified weeks ago remained undisturbed, its heavy steel door still sealed. "We have enough stored for 3 weeks," Marcus reported after his assessment. His engagement had returned with the practical crisis. Logistics was his language, and scarcity gave him vocabulary. With careful rationing the question is whether the neighborhood repopulates with infected before our next supply opportunity. Yuki predicted it wouldn't, at least not quickly. The dispersal pattern pushed them radially from the eastern point. They'll settle into new clustering patterns based on thermal geography. But that takes time to stabilize. Days to weeks. Our area might remain low density for a significant period. Significant meaning? I don't know. This is unprecedented in my observations. We operated in the new reality with cautious optimism. Supply runs became easier without constant infected presence. But we maintained noise discipline and timing protocols. The absence of immediate threat created its own psychological challenge. Relaxation after sustained vigilance produced a particular exhaustion, the kind that accumulates when the body finally acknowledges the debt it's been carrying. Davis slept longer. Nina's hand steadied for the first time in weeks. Marcus reconnected with the group slowly, his participation in evening discussions moving from terse functionality towards something resembling engagement. But on day 46, the change we'd feared most arrived not from the infected, but from humans. Kira spotted them first through our surface exit during a routine observation. 3 figures moving through the parking lot above us with deliberate attention. They weren't passing through. They were searching. They moved in a patterned systematic, grid-based checking behind structures, looking at the ground, pausing at unusual features. One of them wore a corrections uniform shirt. "Davis," Kira said after descending so quickly she nearly fell from the ladder. "Davis, they're here. The men from the hardware store. They're searching the parking lot." The group mobilized with terrifying speed, a transformation from civilian survivors to threatened animals in the space of heartbeats. Davis took command without discussion, his military authority filling the vacuum of peacetime uncertainty. "Seal the surface exit. Cover the shaft cap with debris from below so it can't be spotted. Close all dampers. Full silence protocol. No movement, no light, no sound until they pass." We complied in under 90 seconds. The garage went dark and silent. 6 people holding their breath in 40,000 square feet of a forgotten concrete. Above us, footsteps on asphalt. Voices muffled by distance and earth, but present. Thermal reading, somewhere in this block. Has to be a group. They had thermal detection equipment. The cold snap had made our baffled ventilation irrelevant. Someone above us had technology that could read temperature differentials through our countermeasures. I looked at Kira in the darkness. Her face was invisible, but I felt her tension, the engineer who designed our invisibility confronting its failure. "The baffles work at distance," she breathed, barely audible. "But if they're directly above us with handheld thermal..." She didn't finish. The footsteps moved closer to where our emergency exit shaft terminated. A pause. A voice directly above. "Here, there's something here." In the darkness, Davis's hand found my shoulder. His grip communicated what words couldn't. "Prepare to move." The ramp. Our original exit. If the surface shaft was discovered, the pumping station remained our path out. But the voices above continued, and what they said next reframed everything. "This is concrete poured, sealed, old construction. See the edges? There's something underneath this lot." A second voice. "Could be sewer, storm drain, city infrastructure." "No. The thermal signature is too large and too uniform. It's a space, an occupied space. There are people down there." Third voice, deeper, carrying authority. "Then we talk to them. Put the weapons down." Silence above. Then projected downward with force. "We know you're below. We can detect your heat. We're not hostile. Repeat, we are not hostile. We're looking for survivors to consolidate with. Safety in numbers." Davis removed his hand from my shoulder. In the dark, I could feel the group's collective tension reshape itself. Fear recalibrating, combat readiness shifting toward assessment. "It could be genuine," Nina whispered. "It could be the men who attacked us," Davis replied. "They said put weapons down," Yuki observed. "That suggests internal discipline. A code. The hardware store encounter was opportunistic violence. This sounds organized." From above, the authoritative voice again. My name is Sergeant Cole Hadley, former corrections officer at Eastern State. I have 43 people under my leadership. We've been searching for survivors since the mass dispersal 4 days ago. We have food, medicine, weapons, and secure territory along the river. We're offering alliance, not threat. 43 people. The number staggered me. We'd been surviving as 6 in our forgotten hole, while someone nearby had maintained a group 8 times our size. They had resources, organization, a leader with a title and authority. "Decision," Davis said to me in the dark. His voice carried something I'd never heard from him before. Uncertainty. The military mind that operated in binary engage or withdraw, confronting a scenario that required neither. I looked toward where I knew Kira stood, where Marcus breathed heavily, where Nina waited, where Yuki calculated probabilities in the silence of her thoughts. We respond, I decided, but from position of strength. We reveal nothing about our structure or capabilities. We talk. Davis nodded. I felt the motion in the air between us. He moved to the surface exit shaft, climbed the ladder, and pushed aside the cover. Cold air and daylight cascaded down. "Sergeant Hadley." Davis's voice carried upward with military projection. "Staff Sergeant Davis Wheeler, retired. We're listening." A pause above respect for the rank and tone. Then Hadley's voice modulated. "Staff Sergeant, how many are you?" "Enough. State your terms." "No terms. An invitation. We've established a compound on the river. Industrial buildings converted. The dispersal wave weakened us. We lost 12 people defending the perimeter. We need to rebuild numbers. We're approaching every survivor group we can locate." "How'd you find us?" "Thermal imaging drone. Salvaged from a police depot. We've been flying grid patterns since the wave. Your location shows a consistent 55-degree thermal pool beneath an ambient 28 surface. Invisible to the infected, visible to technology." Our technological invisibility had been defeated by technology. The realization landed with physical weight. Everything Kira had built, the baffles, the concealment, the engineering of absence, rendered moot by a machine flying overhead that could see through earth and concrete. Davis looked down at me. In his eyes, I read the same calculation. Our secret was no longer a secret. Whether we allied with Hadley's group or not, they knew we were here. They knew what our shelter was. The anonymity that had protected us was gone. "Give us 24 hours, Davis called up. A pause. 12. The infected are already beginning to repopulate this sector. Our drone shows cluster formation resuming to the east. By tomorrow night, surface movement becomes dangerous again. If you want safe passage to our compound, it needs to happen by dawn." The shaft cover went back in place. Davis descended. 6 faces in the darkness. 12 hours to decide everything. The debate lasted 4 hours. It was the most intensive, emotionally honest conversation we'd had since forming as a group, every position articulated, every fear named, every calculation laid bare. Marcus spoke first and most forcefully. "We go. Our position is compromised regardless. They know where we are. They know our thermal signature. If we refuse and they decide to take what we have, 6 people cannot resist 43. "We don't know they'd attack," Kira countered. "Hadley offered alliance. He pulled weapons down. That suggests ethical constraint." "Or performance," Davis said. "Performed restraint to gain compliance. I've seen it in institutional settings." "You were in those institutions," Nina observed gently. "Which is why I recognize the tactic." Yuki presented data. If infected clusters are reforming eastward, And Hadley's compound is on the river, also east. They're positioning themselves in the infection's flow path again. Whatever failed before that caused the dispersal wave. They're repeating the conditions for it. Unless they've adapted, Kira argued. Unless losing 12 people taught them to modify their approach. I listened to each perspective, feeling the decision's weight settle on my shoulders, not because anyone appointed me authority, but because this was fundamentally a structural question. Not about steel and concrete, about the structure of survival itself. Here's what I know, I said when silence finally came. This garage has protected us for 46 days. It's thermally stable, structurally sound, acoustically invisible to the infected. Those properties haven't changed. What's changed is that humans with technology have located us. But humans with technology also offer resources we lack: medicine, weapons, numbers. The question isn't whether we join them, I continued. The question is whether we abandon this position entirely or maintain it as a fallback. The idea shifted the room's energy. Not a binary choice, go or stay, but a layered response. Send representatives to Hadley's compound. Assess it. Evaluate whether alliance served our interests. But keep the garage operational as a retreat position if the compound proved unsafe or unsustainable. Who goes? Davis asked. Kira and me, I said. She assesses their infrastructure. I assess their structural security. We report back within 48 hours. That leaves 4 here, Marcus said. If something happens to you, then 4 people maintain the most secure shelter in this city. And Davis knows how to lead a survival group. Dawn approached. Kira and I prepared minimal packs enough for 2 days above ground. Davis briefed us on communication protocols. If we didn't return within 60 hours, the group would seal the garage and assume compromised status. At the surface exit, in gray pre-dawn light, Sergeant Hadley waited with 2 escorts. He was younger than his voice suggested, maybe 40, lean with sun damage and a measured calm in his bearing. He extended his hand. Glad you're coming, both of you? 2 for assessment, I said. The rest hold position. Hadley nodded without surprise. He'd expected this. Smart. Your shelter's remarkable, by the way. Underground civic infrastructure repurposed. We've been looking for spaces like this. Your engineer did exceptional work on thermal suppression. My engineer is standing beside me, I said. Kira didn't smile, but her posture acknowledged the recognition. We walked east into the lightening sky, toward the river, toward 43 strangers and whatever they'd built from the same collapse we'd survived. Behind us, beneath an unmarked parking lot in a forgotten neighborhood, 4 people sealed themselves underground and waited for us to return, with the future whatever shape it took. The garage had been our sanctuary, our secret, our architecture of absence that hid us from a world determined to consume everything it touched. Perhaps it would remain that a hidden heart beneath a dead city, pumping survival into a small number of bodies that remembered how to live quietly. Or perhaps it would become something else. A node in a network, a piece of a larger structure, a single room in a building that many hands were trying to construct from the ruins of one that had fallen. I didn't know which outcome I preferred. I only knew that the concrete beneath that parking lot was sound, and whatever happened next, it would endure. Hadley's compound was real. Imperfect, overcrowded, vulnerable in ways Kira identified within hours, but real. 43 people maintaining existence through collective effort and military discipline. They had generators and greenhouses and a perimeter that held against moderate pressure. They had children. I hadn't seen children in months. We didn't abandon the garage. We couldn't. Instead, it became what I'd instinctively understood it should be. A fallback, a way station, a quiet place for small groups to recover before rejoining the larger effort. Kira improved its systems remotely, visiting weekly to maintain and upgrade. Davis ran it as a safe house for scouting teams operating in the Western District. The garage outlived every other shelter we'd occupied. Its strength was never just structural, it was conceptual. A place that existed by being forgotten, that protected through absence rather than force. I think about it sometimes, that first night on cold concrete. 5 people listening to the world end above them and finding, in the silence below, something worth building from. Not a fortress, not a home, a possibility. The negative space in which survival could take its first quiet breath. We lived because nobody remembered that place existed, and because we chose to fill its emptiness with purpose.